Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming on this beautiful day to our 9th Annual Teaching and Learning Conference. I'm Trevor Holmes from the Center for Teaching Excellence. We appreciate, of course, the hard work that got you in here so efficiently by this helpful team of people wearing red shirts, the current and former co-op students from CTE. So ask them anything, the people wearing red vests. Thank you, co-op students, for getting us together this morning. So to kick off our conference, we have with us today our president, Felten, who had so many meetings, but as soon as he found out when our 9th annual conference was, he pushed them all back so that he could come here and open it for us. So thanks, Felten. Come on up.
Thanks very much, Trevor, and good morning, everybody. Before I start, let me acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand track. It's the land promised to the Six Nations that extends to 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. So it is important to acknowledge where we are, but our ancestry of this land before we started. I'm so pleased to be here. It's great to be here. As Trevor said, there were many other things. I don't know what he and Donna did, but I was planning to stay another night in Montreal where I was yesterday, and I was told by my people in my office, absolutely not, you're coming back. You're flying, walking, driving, whatever, but you're coming back for this event. And I'm so glad that I am here. And I'm so pleased that you took the time to be here, this very important event. I, again, want to congratulate Donna Ellis and Trevor Holmes and the great team for the 9th year for organizing this great event. And, of course, our great students in their red vests. They're fantastic, aren't they? Why are we here? What is the significance of being here discussing about teaching and learning? And what does it mean to the people who are here studying at this university or at universities around the world? As I was walking here, I said, I'm delighted that we're going to have this conversation at the Science Teaching Complex. This is the first time in the history of our university as ever I recall that we called a building a teaching complex. And as I was again walking here, I said, where were these people when I was a student? And the concept of teaching and learning and the emphasis and importance we put on this is tremendously important. There isn't a single day that whether I am talking to people in the government or private sector industry, the issue of the need for talent, the need for students, graduates, who will have a deep understanding of their subject matter, but they could be so creative, they could be so articulate, they could have a much broader understanding of concepts that are so important to them. That is graduates or students who are able to learn because they have come from an organization, they come from a system which they were made curious about things. They learn because they are curious about things. And this is the theme of this year's conference. I'm so glad that it's about cultivating curiosity in teaching and learning. There is nothing in my mind more important than this aspect. Today we're blessed with so many technological tools that will enable us to find out about things long before we come to a classroom and we sit where you are now and listen to a person who knows more about a subject than you would. That's how it was about 1,000 years ago when people in Bologna, students from all around the world, they said, well, we are curious. We want to learn about these certain things. We don't know about them. And first thing, let's find the people who would know more about these things than we would. So they actually gathered together, put their monies together, and hired people who will teach them. And we continued that model for many, many hundreds and hundreds of years. We are in a situation right now that you don't really need to go too far to find people who will know about the subject than you would. You could just click a couple of buttons and then here they are. So what are we doing here in terms of enabling that knowledge gap, to close that gap? Simply, in my mind, this is exactly the topic here. After people are curious, we go and dig deeper and deeper into that curiosity and get people to learn things that in a way that is really deep, but it's also connected to many other aspects of what we do here at our university. Last year's theme, I heard it was teaching and learning through challenges and failure. Again, so important here. Before I touch on this subject, I was joking this morning that I love this year's theme, the cultivating curiosity, and I was saying that the linkage with a cat and curiosity, we never use it here. We let our students to go as curious as they can be. When it comes to challenging and failure, I want to talk about a little bit more because this year we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of our university, and we'll look back a little bit, why are we here? How did it all start? Why did a group of very visionary, courageous people come together and said, we need a different kind of university, a university that could offer education a different way and, work integrated learning, co-op. And it was a challenge to start something in an environment that was deeply entrenched in the traditional way of offering education. And when this new initiative came forward, a lot of people looked at them like they were crazy, they were from a different planet, and they didn't really even, bet on the success of the university. They thought that it was going to fail miserably. I know I'm giving just a little tiny bit of time here, but I'm gonna abuse my privilege, and I'm gonna share a story, personal story with you, and it's a really important story for me. When I started many years ago as a young assistant professor in my department, there were like so many much older full professors in my department, and of course as a newcomer they're kind of looking at you and saying, well, what are you gonna do? So at one of the department meetings, I gathered all my courage and thing. I said, look, why don't we think about this co-op program for a little bit? There's some merit into co-op program. And as I was right in the middle of my sentence, I was interrupted by one of the senior colleagues, kind of looked at me as if I had some sort of a mental disorder and said, co-op? Why would the students leave this place and go and almost like contaminate their learning from, with work experience? So I pushed it on a little bit more, and I gave the example of the University of Waterloo. I said, look, this is how they're doing it, isn't it great? So he got further annoyed with me and looked at me and said, look, young man, if you like it so much, why don't you just go there? I sent him a note after I came here. It took me a while, but So that is the beauty of our approach to, in general, teaching and learning. Learning takes place at many places now. It doesn't just have to be restrained in a physical environment like this. It is tremendously important, but it is when you connect it to so many things and broaden the curiosity of, the minds of our students, that makes it tremendously more effective. And why did we last year? I thought about it quite a bit. I said, why did we use challenge and failure? So challenge part, we put this great challenge in front of us, and I'm so glad that 60 years later, I'm standing here and standing in front of the whole world and saying that our experiment worked. That was a great challenge. We didn't want to start an easy way where University of Toronto was 130 years ahead of us. Western was how many years ahead of us? We found a new way of doing things. And failure, we talk about failure quite a bit. And we say, look, if you don't risk, if you don't start thinking outside of the box. If you don't challenge what you're reading in your textbook, or even what your professor is saying here, then you're just limiting your ability to learn as to what you have in front of you. But if you challenge your mind, and if you take risks in learning what you do, you may fail. You may fail miserably. You may get a big fat 0 for your answer in your test, but you had the courage of trying something different. You had the courage of thinking outside of the box, and the rewards could be fantastic. So, you have an exciting day ahead of you. There's a lot of conversations that I wish I could stay here and take part in, but I know that there are some people who will be telling you some very important things. I'm so delighted to be here. I'm so delighted to have the ability to even have this little conversation with you because it's therapeutic at the same time. I looked at the rest of my day. I said, this is the best part of the day. I'm going to talk about teaching and learning. Donna, Trevor, where are you, Trevor? I thank you again for insisting that I came here, and I thank you, however, more than that, for what you've been doing, constantly improving the quality of teaching and learning at the University of Waterloo for everybody, for our faculty members and for our students. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
So for 5 of the 9 years of our conference, we had able and caring chairship from our instructional developer for research and consulting, Julie Timmermans. And while she has now gone away and joined the faculty at the University of Otago in New Zealand, she's definitely here in spirit. Because of her meticulous notes, we have a conference, and at her prompting, a theme, and a keynote speaker. So anything that goes right today is thanks to her, and anything that doesn't is my fault, okay? However, as of last week, we are so pleased to introduce to you our new instructional developer, research and consulting, Crystal C. She's co-chairing the conference with me this year and taking over for next year. And so she's the one who's ready and waiting to take all your teaching and learning related research questions after your day of mental and emotional immersion in SAME. Maybe not after the wine and cheese, but soon and for the rest of your time here. So, a couple of logistical notes. The food at the Faculty Association sponsored breakfast will be in 2 identical tables. You saw them out there while you were lining up for your registration. So make 4 lines at those 2 tables. They'll be identical on each side, so that makes 4 lines, yeah? Okay. If you just want beverages, they're at separate spots, right? They're out and over to the right. So there's 2 beverage stations separate from the food stations. And at lunch, I've been asked to remind you that if you find that the buffet does not have the food that you requested and there's nothing that you can eat there as your lunch, approach the supervisors right away who will have a lunch already prepared for you if you had special dietary needs that are not dealt with on the table itself. That's how they've approached it. So they've asked me to remind you of that. Washrooms. There are a couple of washrooms out the back of this lecture hall, and of course, there are some washrooms outside on the main floor of the lecture hall, but you have to go all the way around past the one old wall of biology to the other old wall of biology, and then they're across from that. And then downstairs, they're in the northwest corner. So once you're downstairs. So I'd also like to thank Mario Canelio, our AVPA, who has generously funded almost all of this conference. And thanks to your chairs and teaching fellows and yourselves for coming and paying your bit too. So thanks, Mario, for being the founder of the feast. Okay. Turning our attention to our keynote speaker. Peter Felton today brings with him a wealth of experiences from around the world working with practitioners and researchers. I'm pretty sure I met him in real life rather than social media in Sweden. And I've been following him ever since. Not following him in a stalkery way. I mean like, on Twitter. So all the higher ed specialists I knew, and that's like hundreds, right, kept saying, you have to meet this person. And they were right. So I'm really excited to have him here right on our campus today. the Assistant Provost for Teaching and Learning at Elon University, where he founded the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning. He's, as I say, traveled extensively and spoken about topics like student transformation, students as partners in research, faculty mentoring communities, diversity and inclusion, and in a recent article, the role of emotion in learning partnerships. He has many books to his name as a collaborator and an editor, and most of which are out in the foyer if you're interested in getting one at a discount today. The bookstore has generously brought some along. Former president, I believe, of the POD network, the Professional and Organizational Development Network, which is kind of like the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, only in the States, of which our own Donna Ellis has played a very active role as well. We're really looking forward this morning, Peter, to your wisdom and provocations about curiosity. Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor, Donna, Julie from afar, for having me here. What I want to do with you today and ask you to do is think about this question of, can we teach curiosity? Right? Often when people think about curiosity, they think about it as a trait, as something that you either are or you're not. People sometimes say Peter is a curious person. Now, usually what they mean is strange, but they could also mean someone who's just naturally curious, right? And even a phrase like naturally curious implies there are people who are curious, and there are people who are not curious, right? And what I want to do today with you for the next 3 hours, right? Or so, 7 hours, yeah, until we get to the wine and cheese. Now, for the next hour or so is challenge that and think about curiosity actually as a practice. Curiosity as something that anyone can do. Curiosity is something that everyone does. Curiosity is something that you can get better at. And that to suggest that actually one of the most important things we can do in higher education is help our students become more curious and more skillful in their curiosity, perhaps more disciplined in their curiosity, right? So that's sort of where we're going. I know there's lots of people from different roles at the university and other universities here. I'm going to ask you to speak several times to people. You can do it. When I do that, my general frame is going to be thinking about the classes you teach or a course you're working on or something like this. If you're a graduate student or someone who doesn't teach, adapt the question, right? Think about the work you do and how you can do that, okay? And something Trevor didn't say, but I feel like I need to put out front, is I'm actually a historian by training. And quite a lot of what I'm talking about is my reading of psychology and economics literature, so good luck. We'll see how that goes. But I would like you to begin actually by turning and introducing yourself to a couple people near you, 2 or 3 or 4 at the most, and talking just for a couple minutes about these 2 questions. What do you want your students to be curious about? And how do you know when they're curious? Okay? I'll give you a couple minutes, then we're going to talk. Okay, I would love to hear just a little bit and have the whole room hear a little bit of some different answers people have to these questions, starting with the first one. So, and it's very strange as I look up there because the words are backwards as I look, and I'm like, how do you say that? What do you want your students to be curious about? So, you were talking, presumably you were on task, so what did someone say? What do you want your students to be curious about? Something. Anything, right? Awake, breathing, curious. Okay.
Anything other than, is this all the final exam?
So not simply grade-related curiosity. Okay. The bar is being set really high. Yeah.
How to take the content and apply it to different situations.
How to take some content from here and apply it over there in different situations. Psychologists sometimes call that transfer of learning. It's actually one of the hardest things to do when you learn something. That's a good one. The others are good too. That's a really good one. Are there, yes?
Less about what and more about why.
Why instead of just what. Excellent. Yeah. So you want them to go deeper, to dig in. Do any of you teach disciplines here? Because everyone's talking, it's great, but everyone's saying very generic things. Yeah.
This is cheating. I teach in biology.
Yeah.
Life. I want them
So you're curious about life.
define broadly.
Okay, wow, we could spend days thinking, wow. But that's great. You want them to be curious both in general about life and then in particular about biological life. In some ways, it's about the transfer thing too. How does what we learn in a discrete way transfer from the classroom to the world, but in a broad way too? Yeah.
We had a very specific one here.
Yeah.
How does entanglement arise?
How does entanglement in physics? Okay, yeah. There was a dance picture up there, though, and I wanted to make the case very briefly that you could be curious physically as well as intellectually, right? But how does entanglement arise? Okay, so we know there's lots of different ways students could be curious, lots of different goals we have for curiosity. How do we know when students are curious, besides about whether something's going to be on the test? We know how they're curious about that. So how do you know if they're curious about life or about entanglement or about...
I'll have students email me or post on our social media site about things that they find on their own.
So you're prompting students? No. They do it on their own. So they can just tell you stuff they learn that's related to class.
They'll find something,
Yeah.
an article online and use for it.
Yeah. And they do this?
Sometimes.
Wow. So at least sometimes they're curious, or sometimes they're out in the applied world looking at your classroom and saying this is relevant. Okay, so that's one example. Way in the back.
They come and ask me esoteric questions that I can't necessarily answer.
So when they ask really good questions. Yeah. When they're on Wikipedia. There we go. Although I've been stunned to learn that one of the first places students at my university go to research something, according to the research librarians at my university, is YouTube. Really? Okay. But so when they're seeking information, not just social information, although they're curious socially too. Other ways? Can you tell in a room like this if people are curious?
Interest.
What?
When they show interest.
Yeah? Say that again?
When they show interest.
When they show interest, right. So they look like they're curious. They wonder, they scratch their head, right? Yeah.
When something that extends outside the room, when conversations about the course happen everywhere else.
So when conversations about the course happen everywhere else, and not just, isn't Professor Felton an awful teacher, right? No, that's great. I mean, one of the things, I think I win as a teacher when I walk out of the classroom and I hear my students talking about history. Yay. In fact, one of the fun things I do on my campus is I run a non-credit seminar for students where we read higher education research, and then we talk about it in their lives. And one of the things we read a couple years ago was about integrative learning, and the students kept saying, the most important conversations we have are when you're not around. And what our job is to set them up to have better conversations with each other. So there might be times, and I love this as a segue perhaps, we may not see their curiosity. We may see their fear about the exam, or their worries about a relationship, or their complexity because they have a job and a family and things like this. And we don't see that when they go home, they're actually digging into this and thinking about this. And I think one of the things I want to encourage everybody to do, it's one of the challenges I find in my own teaching, is to start by assuming the best of our students, to assume that they're actually curious, to assume that they're trying and thinking about these things, even if I don't see it. There was a study long ago that I loved, just when laptops started coming into the classroom, and at Purdue University they did this study, and what they found is when students had laptops in the classroom, and the students were looking at their laptops, the professors assumed they weren't engaged. But actually, when the researchers looked at what the students were doing on the laptops, it was when they were most engaged with the material. When they were staring at the professor, they were actually mostly daydreaming. So we may not, we may see things in the students and interpret them in certain ways. What happens if you give them the benefit of the doubt at first, right? Okay, so this is where, before we get into what I think we're going to do today, I do want to say that I feel a bit like someone bringing coal to Newcastle, There's spectacular stuff going on at Waterloo around curiosity. I love this project. It's called Crowd Curio. It's from your Department of Human-Computer Interaction. And it's a way of crowdsourcing things where people can be curious, and by doing the curious things, being curious in particular areas and creating content, they're helping to scientists learn stuff too. It's really cool. You should check it out. There's other stuff too, but there's a lot here. What I'm trying to do is bring some things from not here. And where I want us to go for the next hour or so is these three questions. So what is it? How do we teach it? And how do we know if we're actually succeeding? Because again, they may be curious outside, away from us. Or we may have constraints on our teaching. They have to know this material. You know, the president could say, well, you know, they got a 0 on the test, but that's okay, they were curious. Well, at my university, if you get a 0 on too many tests, you don't get to be curious at the university anymore. So how do we, within the constraints of the university, encourage and support students being curious? Okay, so that's where we're going. The first thing I want to point out, and I've sort of hinted at this already, is that everywhere you look in human history, in disciplines and things like this, curiosity is just part of being human. I was actually trying to find some origin stories from this region of Canada that speak to curiosity. And they felt like a stretch, and it felt like I didn't know exactly what I was talking about, but they're all about journeys and about people discovering new things and going new places, of being curious, right? You get Confucius, you get apples in Gardens of Eden, right? From the beginning, people are curious. What happens if? I love this quote from Confucius because the point is that what we should be doing is asking questions. That's how we're good humans, right? So this is one of those things. Curiosity is that's just part of being human. Now, about 150 years ago or so, psychologists and others started studying curiosity. And I wanted to do the historian's version of what psychologists know about curiosity. So start with William James, who sort of started psychology in significant ways. And he said curiosity is an impulse toward better cognition. It's about filling a gap you identify, right? So I'm curious because I don't know something and I want to know something. Sounds like a Harvard professor's definition of curiosity, right? Scholars later, especially this Berlin in the UK, started looking at the world in general, life in general, and said, wait, humans aren't the only things that appear to be curious. And so Berlin came up with these two categories of curiosity: perceptual versus epistemic curiosity. And what he noted is that virtually everything that lives seeks novelty, right? Which is being curious in some ways. So worms act like they're curious. Epistemic curiosity, he said, is sort of distinctly human, and it's about wondering why and wanting to know more rather than just seeking knowledge, okay? So he said there's novelty-seeking and knowledge-seeking curiosity, and there's also specific versus diversive. Specific means I want to know about how cells divide, right? Diversive means I'm bored, I want to know what my friends are up to, right? Diversive is distracting me. Specific is focusing me. Make sense? And for about the last 50 years, those sorts of frames have driven a lot of the research on curiosity. About 10 years ago, some psychologists made a point that historians like to make, which is maybe it's not this or that. Maybe it's both. And so there's this really smart article saying, you know, if you look at curiosity, we shouldn't study it as only epistemic or perceptual, but maybe it's both wanting to know stuff and liking doing novel stuff, right? So it's a bunch of different things, is what psychologists say. This article from Neuron in 2015 is really great as a summary of everything. And it says basically curiosity is about seeking information for a lot of different reasons. And no matter why you do it, it's about learning, right? So I hope as you're thinking about teaching and learning today, you're saying curiosity is one of the primary drivers of learning, right? Sometimes it's driven by specific goals, sometimes by broad ones. Sometimes it's because I'm bored, sometimes it's because I have an assignment. But for lots of different reasons, people are curious, and what they try to do when they're curious is learn stuff. Recently, economists, sociologists have gotten in the game, and there's great research that says curiosity is good for humans, right? If you are curious, according to these scales mostly economists have come up with, some psychologists, you're going to do better in school. You're going to be more skilled in school. This works all levels, from kindergarten through graduate school on the research. You're actually going to do better in school. You're more likely to graduate if you score higher on curiosity scales than lower. You're likely to make more money and be more satisfied at work, and you're likely to be a happier human. I introduced this all to say, wow, we should really teach our students and help our students become more curious. Right? It's good for their work lives, it's good for their personal lives, it's good for their income, it's good for humanity if they are more curious, according to recent research. Now, I have some rules about PowerPoint, and one of them is if you're a Nobel Prize winner, you get to break the rules of PowerPoint. And this is a quote from a Nobel Prize winner recently, James Heckman, right? And there's a lot of words there. What Heckman and his colleague basically are saying is for a century or more, we've studied learning, and what we've really studied is things like intelligence and performance. And he said, and all the ways we study those things, including perhaps how we grade in our classes and what success at university looks like, doesn't actually typically account for things like curiosity, which actually are valued highly in the world and make us happier and better people. But thankfully, he says, we're starting to figure this out. And there are some ways now, and this is 2013, there are some ways now we can measure curiosity, and we know this. Curiosity can be improved. In fact, when you read down to the end, curiosity is one of those things that we might actually be better able to improve as people age, right? There are some things that by the time students get to us, it's hard to work on. Heckman says curiosity can be improved, it's valued, we should do it. But it's difficult to do because the ways we measure intelligence, the ways we measure academic performance, typically don't account for things like curiosity. They account for correctness, right? So what do we do about this? Well, oops, I skipped ahead. I want to skip back. The historian and philosopher in me says, we know what to do about this, right? What we need to do is we need to encourage our students to act like they're curious. Hamlet, I think, said it pretty well, if you don't have the virtue, pretend like you do. But why you do that is because what Aristotle said is we become virtuous by acting virtuous. In other words, we become curious by acting curious. So if we want we tend to think curiosity drives motivation. I'm going to say, actually, what we do with our students can drive what they do. So we can help our students become more curious by making them act like they're curious, encouraging them to act like they're curious, rewarding them for acting like they're curious. Make sense? There's at least one big problem with this, which is that school doesn't really encourage curiosity. There's this wonderful book by Eleanor Duckworth about the benefits of not knowing things. And she looks a lot at how school, and especially primary and secondary school, but also higher education, encourages students to know. What we value in school is being right and being fast about being right. If you know it before you walk in, excellent. If you have to figure it out and you figure it out okay, or if you figure it out correctly, okay. And if you don't know it and you take a long time figuring out, we're punishing you, right? Our exams are about fast demonstration of knowledge. Most of our performance is this. And Duckworth's point with quoting this student, Alec, is that wouldn't it be great if one of the things students learned in our class is that not all their ideas are good ideas. But that's okay. They're not a bad student for having bad ideas. They're a human for having bad ideas, right? And the goal is to get better ideas. How do you do this? Which gets to how do we teach curiosity? Make sense? Now, I've done the historian version of what is curiosity. Anybody have any pressing questions? Psychologists don't get to ask any questions right now. Good, let's get into the heart of things. And how do we teach this? And I want to start this part, this is going to be mildly interactive, by saying some things are just easy to teach, to invoke curiosity. I'm going to give you an example. It's not from my discipline. A student actually showed me this. Maybe some of you know this. And this is real, what I'm going to show you. So if you Google image search C.E.O, Chief Executive Officer, this is from my computer. I'll show you screenshots from my computer on March 26, 2017. This is what you get. This is the first page. What do you see? Well, say it out loud.
White men.
White men, right? So what are CEOs according to Google image search so far? They're white men. But you know, this is just the first page. Maybe this isn't fair, right? So let's go to the second page. What do you see on the second page? Yeah, the first female to show up is CEO Barbie, right? So there are any number of ways. Well, seeing this, I'm curious about a lot of things, right? I'm curious, like, what is Google thinking, right? But, so is this representative of something? You know, I mean, if you looked in the US, let's say, or in Canada, at CEOs of corporations, not necessarily where should Barbie show up, but, you know, where would women show up on that list? Is this representing reality, or is this some quirk of an algorithm? Or is it what? And so I could see doing something like this with a group of students in a lot of different kinds of courses, and the students are going to be fired up already, right? And there's other things you could look at here. You know, there's one guy who appears to be African American so far. You know, there's race, there's gender, there's lots of things going on. There's blue suits out the wazoo. You know, so what is it that's going on here? My point is sometimes there are things that just evoke curiosity. And if you happen to have them in your discipline, you could stop listening. No. If you happen to have them, take advantage of them, right? Use those things. There's a wonderful article by two leading cognitive psychologists called A Time for Telling. It's an old article. It's from the 90s. And what they were trying to do is figure out in this article, in this series of experiments, is could students learn from the most boring university lecture humanly possible? No, so if you've seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Ben Stein is the teacher in there, right? Ben Stein is actually the role model for a video of a physics lecture they created as part of this study, right? So as deadpan dry as they possibly could. And what they did, there were a number of studies here, but one part of it was this Ben Stein study where they had this awful actor do a simple physics lecture for Intro to Physics, video recorded. And then they gave this to students in intro physics courses at a number of different universities. Some of the students just said, instead of coming to class, watch this video, there'll be a test. Some of the students were given a question, which wasn't what happens 15 minutes into the video. It was a broader question, like what is entanglement, or how does entanglement work, right? And the lecture didn't answer the question, but the lecture provided clues to how to answer the question, okay? And what they found is that all the students thought this was the most boring lecture they'd ever seen, but the students who had a question that the lecture touched on learned from the lecture. And the students who didn't have a question didn't learn from the lecture. And so the point of the article, the title of the article is, one of our jobs is to create a time for telling, right? So I could use this Google CEO example as a time for telling about gender. I could use it, in a computing science course about how algorithms work and how video searches. I mean, there's lots of different ways you could do this. But all of a sudden, perhaps, if I walked in and said, what we're going to do is figure out how images are searched on Google, right? Huh. But why is CEO Barbie the first woman to come up? Huh. And could Google build an algorithm that doesn't yield toys in this context? So anyways, the point is we can create times for telling. If we're teaching things where you think your students already are going to be curious, or you can spark their curiosity. But more broadly, we have a harder job. This is another breaking the rules of PowerPoint, but again, this is Herbert Simon won a Nobel Prize, so I can do this. And what he says is that as we think about our teaching, we can't learn for our students. We can't be curious for our students. What we can do is influence what they do, right? So if we want our students to be curious, I can't do that for you. But I can prompt you to act like you're curious. Back to the Hamlet approach. And if they act enough like they're curious, maybe they'll become more curious. Maybe they'll be more skilled in being curious. I'm going to dig into that. So that's our job. We can either capture their natural curiosity about stuff, walking in the doors of our classrooms, or we could create conditions where they act like they're curious about the Ming Dynasty in China, which is one of the things I sometimes teach about, which my students aren't typically curious about. So what do? I'm going to suggest 4 big things we do under the framework of encourage students to practice being curious. Okay, the first one is encourage them to be curious. And I put the word appropriate up there because you may not want to encourage them to be curious about what happened last night, at the bar on Facebook. You might want to encourage them to be curious about entanglement or about gender in executive leadership or about what led to this university being on this bit of land, right? So we're not just encouraging general curiosity here, diverse curiosity, diversive curiosity, but often specific curiosity, disciplinary curiosity, perhaps. So that's part 1. Part 2 is make curiosity a low-stakes activity for them. In other words, when they're curious and they ask a silly question, or they go off on a tangent, or they try something that doesn't work very well, they're not punished. Or not punished too much. And that punishment can come in grades. It can also come from embarrassment. Students and classrooms often are places where you perform, and if you're a good student, you always have the right answer first, right? So how do we make it so it's okay to have the wrong answer? Or okay to try an answer? Okay to make a mistake, right? Because we can't really expect students to risk something if they're going to be punished for risking it. Okay? So that's part 2. You want them practicing, low stakes. You want to provide feedback and guidance on this, right? So in a history class, there are better questions to be curious from a historian's point of view than other questions. So can I show my students what good questions look like? One of the things I have my students do is they send me questions. It's sort of the example you said about students sending in stuff, right? When my students do that, I always bring it into class. And even if they do a lousy job of connecting it to what we're talking about, I make it seem like they're geniuses, or I do my best, right? And it's like, this is a great way of finding history acting in the world today, right? So I'm giving them feedback on certain behavior, which is, wow, this is valued behavior. He noticed when someone did this, and it was sort of interesting. I could do that, right? Or else guidance. And I'll talk more about this in a little bit and get you thinking, we can show them what it's like when we're curious. Because just like our students tend to come into classrooms performing in certain ways and wanting to know the right answer right away, we tend to work everything out before a class happens. And then we come in and we're just showing them everything we worked out, not why, and not any of the struggles or not any of the various paths. So how do we guide them on being curious in our ways? And then the last is to get them to think about their own curiosity. You know, am I being curious here? Was that a good question or a bad question? What happens when I ask a question? What happened when I did this? What did it feel like? Curiosity is actually connected to this psychological term called flow. If you're curious, and you're actively being curious, you tend to feel pretty good. You tend to feel pretty focused. Right? And helping students recognize that. My students know they feel good on Friday nights when they're not thinking about classes. But how do I get them thinking it's actually cool to be in an archive? Because it is. It's really cool to be in an archive, right? So this is what I suggest the heart of what we're trying to do in our classes, is get our students to practice curiosity. Now, I already made the Cole to Newcastle analogy, so I'm going to ask you to talk to your peers again about this and ask you to talk about these two questions. In your teaching, in your courses, when do your students practice being curious? And then when are you showing them what it's like to be curious in biology or in physics or in engineering or in history? Does that make sense? So, give you a few minutes to do that. So I'd like to hear a little bit from a couple people, but before we do that, I'm curious about something. And this is a yes-no sort of curiosity one, which is that first question. How many of you felt like you could answer that first question? You know, I know when students are being curious in my class. Raise your hand if you do. Yeah, so a bunch of people, but not everybody. Makes sense. I'm not surprised. So when are students curious in your class? Can people give a couple specific examples?
When they're quiet and you're very focused on what you're saying.
Ah, so when they're really quiet and they're focused, right? Yeah.
Lots of questions.
Lots of questions. Excellent, yeah.
We have an assignment and then it provides an opportunity or something to go deeper into the question afterwards. Oh, well, this was interesting. I really learned a lot.
Ah, so when they go deeper, right? Yeah.
When we do science activities, they're excited, they're talking a lot, they're having kind of like a playful experience.
Okay, so when they're doing science activities, and I liked your language too, talking, being playful, excited.
I see it a lot with group work, so we do a lot of impromptu, sometimes people do perceptual prep work, and so they really don't even know that they're curious until after.
Right. Well, right. I mean, we can trick them into being curious, right? I mean, they start talking about something that they're not super excited about talking about, but pretty soon they're like, why is that, right? If I had done a survey at the beginning of this talk about, you know, how many of you care about Google image searches of CEOs? They're probably not a lot, anyway. But there's ways to get them involved, yeah.
I'm just thinking about anticipating kind of the closure of something you're presenting or
Yeah. Anticipation, yeah. One of the best teachers I've ever known, a philosopher named Anthony Weston, says he wants his students feeling curious about what's going to happen every day in class. Not uncomfortable and unstable, but curious. So he starts in different ways, and he shows up sometimes like in period costume and things like this. But the point is, he wants them just a little off base, like what's Weston going to do today, right? And anticipating things. If class is always the same, that doesn't encourage curiosity. Yeah.
When there's a wow factor.
When there's a wow factor. Like what?
I teach in fine arts,
Yeah.
so I'll do the demo in printmaking, and
Yeah.
like it's magic.
Yeah.
So they're just like, whoa.
Whoa, I know. I always envied the chemists who get to blow stuff up. And like, wow, they're all awake now, you know. Historians blow stuff in the past up. It's not as exciting. Yeah.
I teach international students, so English is not their first language.
Mm-hmm.
In discussion groups, I'll hear them using interlanguage to help them try to understand concepts.
Ah. Well, that's a great example where they're trying to mix something they know with something they're learning, right? And that's great. That's what we want them to do. That's being curious. Way in the back.
I teach a second-year history science course, and one thing I like
Yeah. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. That's a great example, and I want to tease it out for two reasons. One is, and I don't know Canadian higher education very well, but U.S. higher education, students don't typically come to university with a lot of agency about themselves as learners. You know, the sense that I'm going to try to figure this out and I'm going to do this. It's like I'm going to take what's given and I'm going to give it back, undamaged, and everything will be okay, right? That's the goal. And so this idea of shifting what they think their role is in the classroom and at university is really important. So even getting them curious about what do you think students should do? But the other thing I want to pick up on in what you're saying is you're teaching a second-year research methods course. And so I think helping our students become curious works so much better when we're doing it together, right? When in the introductory courses that are going to feed them into the research methods course, they're already being poked and prodded and asking questions. And then after the research methods course, the faculty teaching those courses know to expect and to challenge students to ask their own questions and things like this, right? So how do we weave curiosity, integrate it through, rather than just in little isolated bits in our classes? I think is one of the big challenges. It's also one of the great opportunities of this work. So could you all answer the question about when is your curiosity visible in the course? Do you show it? Do you let on that this is interesting?
I switched disciplines about 5 years ago, so I'm often in a situation where I don't actually get the answers to their questions.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if it's curiosity as much as just being very honest about the limits of my own understanding.
Yeah.
And saying that that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so recognizing the limits of your own understanding and being public about them? Yeah.
I'm in English language studies, and I show them curiosity by asking them about how to say certain concepts in their language.
Yeah.
Chinese, Japanese, or Persian, etc.
Yeah, which is great, right? Because it's switching the roles too. They're the experts now, and you're a learner, right? Yeah.
Librarian, I find it interesting to come to classes without prepared examples
Yeah.
and asking the students to throw something and let's sort of play with that.
Oh, that's great, right. So you could spontaneously develop these things. It's sort of an improv approach, which is actually, I think it can be really helpful because the students get to see you thinking. Let me tell a tale on myself here just really quickly about why I think this last part is important. I'm a historian. Often what I teach about and study is about race in the United States. And so I teach a course where we get into some pretty horrible things about racial violence and whatnot. And what I used to do is prepare myself for these classes, right? And get psyched up and get emotionally in control and everything. And then I would just talk with students and show them stuff, and they would be basket cases. Actually, the first time I taught this course on segregation in the United States, one class, only 3 people came to class because of the homework I'd given them, which was to look at photos of lynchings and do some analysis of this. And I wanted them to look at these photos because I wanted them to recognize the violence that was inherent in that system. But what I learned is that I was doing a terrible job showing them how historians ask questions about awful things in the past, right? And so what I've had to do is shift my teaching to talk in this class a lot more about how do you do this? Why would we as historians look at these kinds of images? And how do we do this? And that it's hard for me to do this, right? And that I come in, I don't want to do this, but I think there's value in doing it. And so it can be emotional and things like this. My point is, I think sometimes we hide what motivates us. We hide what drives us to do this work. And I know often we teach introductory courses and we're not really interested. I didn't become a historian because so much stuff happened and I can tell it all to you. But so how do we bring the curiosity that drives our disciplinary inquiry and our own passions into the classroom a little bit? Because I think the more we can model that, the more we can show ourselves being curious, the better. What I want to do is, I have to keep saying Cole to Newcastle. So there's really cool examples at Waterloo that I found without being that good of a researcher on folks doing things to develop curiosity among their students. This integrated curriculum in tourism studies, which has an explicit goal of enhancing intellectual curiosity. Right? So there's folks around you who you could say, how did you do this in tourism studies? Through the curriculum. How cool is that, right? I want to give you two examples not from Waterloo. One from my own teaching because I love this example and it's worked in lots of different settings with lots of different people, and one from an engineering school, which I don't know anything about engineering, but it's a cool example. So, first example is from a course that I've taught for years. It's a senior seminar for history and African American studies majors on the United States in the 1960s. And the first time I taught this course, I thought it was going to be awesome, and the students were really excited, and they were curious about the 60s, because their grandparents now grew up. Don't get me started, right? But they've seen Forrest Gump, so they know what the 60s are all about. And at the end of the term, the first time I taught the course, I was so frustrated because what the students, it turns out, they had a really strong narrative of how the 60s worked in the United States. And everything we studied, they just crammed into that narrative. So it was peace and love in the beginning of the 60s, with John Kennedy and Martin Luther King marching together towards freedom. And then they were both shot and the United States invaded Vietnam and the world fell apart, right? So anything that was about conflict was in the late 60s, and anything about peace and love was in the early 60s. And I kept saying, it's more complicated than this, it's more complicated than this. And so I had a good 9 months between teaching this course and being super frustrated and developing again. I talked to a lot of my WISE Teaching Center and history colleagues, and I developed an activity that we do now in this class. I do it in almost all my history classes. It's the very first thing students do on the first day of class. We don't talk about the syllabus or anything. I get them into groups, and I give them 10 sources on the 1960s. This is an example of mostly photos because it's fairly quick for them to work through photos. I give them excerpts of speeches and things like this too. 10 things. And I say, your job in your small group, you have 20 minutes, is to put these in order from 1960 to 1970. Right? First of all, that's like the most boring task humanly possible. But they get so into it, I don't tell them it doesn't count at all, whether you get it right or not. I don't need to. They are competitive. They are eager. They are like, don't listen to our group. We've got this, right? And I give them some things that I think are going to be sort of easy. Like some of the students know about, the sit-ins in Nashville and places like that, or Muhammad Ali. The picture on the top left is actually from a civil rights training. And if you dig into it, it's fascinating because there's all these people with name tags looking at this one guy appearing to beat another guy, but they're all smiling and clapping. Right? And so the students have a hell of a time with that one, which is great, right? And what I ask them to do is get in their groups, and they've got a handout with all the images, and they've got each of the images, and then they've got a handout that says, 1 to 10, put them in order, and then they have to answer these questions. What do you know about each of these images or texts? How do you know about it? And then what's missing both that you don't understand within the image and what's missing from the narrative of the 60s? I often do this without any images where women are in the foreground. So there might be women, for example, there's a woman in this picture, there's women in that picture at the top, but no pictures of women sort of front and center. Like, or no pictures of the Vietnam War. Or no pictures, or whatever. And so I want to see, what do they know, what don't they know? And I want them asking themselves in class, from the beginning, what do I know about things? What don't I know about things? What's missing? What's the story not telling me, right? To close this little story off, first of all, this exercise works spectacularly well, every time. And they get so excited if they get it right. No one, I've actually done this with groups of historians this side. Nobody ever gets it right all the way because I'm mean. And there are some things like Richard Nixon's inaugural address in 1969, which sounds like John Kennedy, because it's all about peace and love. And you say that's Nixon, and they're like, no way, right? But the point isn't getting it right. The point is digging into what you know and don't. But the main thing I want to say here is at the end of this exercise, the first time I've done it, and every time since, the students are saying, wow, it's more complicated than I thought. I'm like, awesome. Your peers didn't learn that in a whole semester last time I taught this course, right? So how do we give students short in-class activities that low stakes, there's no grade here, there's never been an ask of does this count? Is this going to be on the test? How much does this count? But that engage them in being curious. Second example is from Ohio University. It's their mechanical engineering program. And I know there may be programs like this. There may be something actually quite like this at Waterloo. But I think this Designing to Make a Difference program is really an interesting model in a couple ways. So it's a fourth-year capstone mechanical engineering course. It's a year-long course where mechanical engineering students in sort of seminar setting work with community partners to develop engineering solutions to this community problem. That's pretty cool. I know lots of engineering courses do this. The part that I like the most, well, so the fourth-year students have to be curious about what the community actually needs, because they've got a whole year to work with them. And it's not just about what works in the classroom, it's what works in the community and all this, right? You get all this. The part that I think is so clever about this Designing to Make a Difference program at Ohio is first-year mechanical engineering students in their core first-year course act as consultants to the fourth-year students. So the fourth-year students come into the first-year class and pitch to them, so here's the problem the community defined, here's a solution we think might work, right? And they get feedback in small groups and large group from the first years. Then as they're developing prototypes and things like this, they bring in the first years before they go to the community. And the first years poke and prod at it and ask questions and all this. And what's happening is the first years are seeing what fourth-year mechanical engineering students do, seeing what they know. They're getting to be experts because one of the things the faculty always frame this as is the students, the fourth years, aren't working with engineers in the field. They're working with normal humans, right? And first-year undergraduates aren't really engineers yet. They're normal humans. More, right? So they are a good stand-in for the community, right? So they encourage the first years to think creatively, to think critically about these things, right? So they're getting students to act curious. First year, fourth year, connected through the program. Make sense? I'm going to give you a couple minutes now, and I'm going to actually ask you to do this. No one succeeds, but I'm going to ask you to do this quietly. Maybe even silently, which is think about something you teach and outline for yourself one thing you could do in that teaching to help your students develop some curiosity in that course or in that program, right? So make some notes to yourself. What are students going to do to be curious, and why are they doing that thing? How is doing this low stakes for them? And I want you to remember low stakes, not just about grade, but also about embarrassment for being wrong or having crazy ideas and things like this. And then how are they getting feedback and guidance? And how will they reflect on their own curiosity? How will they notice they're being curious? And that was a good question, that wasn't. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do this, which isn't super long. You can actually talk to the person next to you if you want, but you can also just sit and write and take some notes for yourself. Okay, so I want to poke for a minute at this and then give you a chance to talk with each other one more time before we close, right? And so the big question is, so now what I'm doing in my teaching is I'm trying to get my students to practice being curious. How would I know if they're getting better? That's hard to know, right? Because as we said, they may be curious away from us, or they may be curious about things that you can't test. That was one of Heckman's points, that we're good at testing certain things and we're good at developing curiosity. We're just not good at testing that. And do you want to really test in a physics course, are students more curious about entanglement? I don't know. So I think to do this, the general approach is to take a sort of scholarly approach to your teaching. So think about, start with a question. How do I get my students to be more curious about how cells divide? Or about how algorithms work on Google, or whatever it happens to be, about printmaking, right? And then build on what's known. That's what scholars do. They don't just make stuff up. They study some things. Then they collect and analyze evidence, which could be evidence. It could be examples of student work. It could be lots of different things. And then you use and share what you learned, right? You analyze, use, share. So let me give you an example of some colleagues of mine who've done this in a really interesting way about curiosity. The course is somewhat unusual, so this is not, I'm not suggesting you all teach just like this, but just this is an example of developing curiosity and studying whether students are getting more curious in a course. This is a 1-month course. It's a January course. It's for first-year honors students at my university. And the students spend about 4 days together at the beginning of January on campus. Then they go to Italy for 3 weeks with 2 faculty, and they do a bunch of stuff in Italy that's related to the course, and then they come back and they have 3 days together at the end. And the goal, one of the main goals of this course, is to help these students who are really good at being students, but actually not very good at being curious and exploring and playful intellectually, to become more curious, right? So the faculty want the students to develop their scholarly curiosity and a little bit of their personal curiosity. And so this is their approach to this. Their main question for the course is, are our students at the top, are our students becoming more curious? Right? And what they decided to do is teach and assess informed by what they could know about curiosity. I'll give you an example, a couple examples of that. And then they did class activities. I'll give you examples of those that get students practicing being curious. And then they assessed the results of those class activities and used that to inform future teaching. Does that make sense? So it's a scholarly cycle here. They used 2 different sets of resources in particular. And just so you know, the faculty here are religious studies and history. But what they did is they consulted with the teaching center and some psychologists. And 2 of the most useful sets of resources they used, this is from a group called the American Association of Colleges and Universities. They have these things called value rubrics, right? And this rubric is about assessing intercultural knowledge and competence. The red circled area is about curiosity. And so this rubric was really helpful for them because it said this is what it looks like to be sort of baseline university student curious about other cultures, and this is what it looks like to develop over time, right? So what they were trying to do is move their students from benchmark towards capstone in 1 month. They also went to the Positive Psychology Center's website at the University of Pennsylvania, where there's a ton of freely available and well-researched measures of things like curiosity. And they decided, even though they're religious studies and historians, they were going to do a pre and post test using this scale. Curiosity and exploration. It's more than 4 questions, right? So this is what they did besides this scale. While the students were in Italy, every day the students were required to keep a curiosity journal where they were supposed to write a few times a day at least a paragraph or a set of questions about something that they were curious about. And the faculty encouraged them to be wide open, right? It could be about what we were studying. It could be about why are all the people wearing jeans or boots up to their hips or whatever it happens to be, right? At the end of the term, students had to write a reflective essay about their own curiosity. And the only text they could use was their journal. And it was graded, they said, just like a regular scholarly essay where you should cite multiple sources. So you should cite your own journal multiple times and different parts of your journal, and you should analyze what you're doing, right? So students are being prompted to be curious about their own curiosity and their own sorts of questions. And then the faculty, actually, when they were in Italy, kept a journal. They each kept a journal for themselves about what they saw in students. When did students seem to be most curious and most engaged and whatnot, right? And then one of the things they did the last day of class, was the heart of the last day of class, is they actually gave students homework. They'd already, all the students had written their reflective essays. And the faculty had done the pre-post test. And they gave the results aggregated to the class and said, read this, look at this. Look at your own journal. They actually made all of the reflective essays ungraded, available to the class so they could see each other's reflective essays. And they made excerpts of their own journals available to the class. And they did this 2 days before the class. And they said, read as much of that as you can. And then the last day of class, they had this conversation about curiosity. And one of the questions was, what's it mean to be curious as a student? What's it mean to be curious as an honor student? What's it mean to be curious in a different culture? To be curious in a different discipline? And how would we know if we're getting more curious? I've observed this conversation. It is awesome. So the faculty feel like the students are becoming more curious. They can't necessarily prove it. The scale doesn't move that much. In fact, many students move backwards on the scale. And they think that's because they sort of assume I'm really curious, and then they start looking at their own curiosity and like, I'm not, right? Does that make sense? So the faculty are going through this cycle with their students. Okay. So what I want to do is just give you a couple minutes to think about, you sketch this little plan for curiosity in your own course. And just think for a minute about, so how am I going to know if this is working? What's the evidence that's going to be created by this? Which could be just watching the students, it could be work students produce, it could be conversations you have with them, whatever. And how are you going to analyze that evidence? Does that make sense as a prompt? So spend just a minute thinking about that. How am I going to know? One is a quote from a scholar who actually studies and does mediation around the world in conflict zones. And he talks a lot about what he calls paradoxical curiosity. And his point is that curiosity shouldn't be used as a way to simplify or to wash away differences. But curiosity needs to be seen as a way to hold open paradoxes, to recognize that conflicts still can exist, that some things aren't resolvable, right? And so as we encourage our students to be more curious, how do we encourage them to be humane, too? And to be open to not saying, why do people behave that way? Well, that's stupid. But wow, that's different, right? So curiosity in and of itself, Letterman would say, isn't a good. Letteruch would say, it's paradoxical curiosity that's a good. It's really deep, far beyond my capacity. The last thing I want to leave you with, besides some references, is something from John Dewey. And he didn't win a Nobel Prize, but I'm giving him lots of words anyways. And Dewey is sort of, you have to bow down to Dewey in education, but partly because he's really smart. And I think this is a helpful point to close on, which is sometimes curiosity, actually thinking about curiosity in our courses, in our curriculum, in our classrooms, might be harder for us than it is for our students. Right? We are the ones who built the structures of grading and assessing and all these sorts of things that make it hard for students to demonstrate their curiosity. We're the ones who design the assignments that squeeze the life out of them sometimes. Or the lab activities, which either can be really great opportunities for curiosity or just mind-numbing, cookie cutter, etc. So how do we see it as our job to bring curiosity into this work? Because Dewey would say they're coming to us curious, whether they show it or not. So how do we not dissipate that with trivial things? And how do we capture their curiosity so that they learn as much as they can, and we teach as well as we can? That's all I got. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I have with me today Dr. Shannon Day, a former teaching fellow from Arts, who's representing the Faculty Association today in thanking you for your wonderful igniting of our ideas.
Thanks, Trevor.
And especially thank you to Professor Felton for just really the perfect talk to start off this conference. I'm sure that many of you know, because we're all fancy egghead types, that curiosity and curate actually come from the same root. They both come from the Latin word cura, for care. If you're in classics, I'm wrong, tell me later privately. And one of the things that I loved about your talk this morning, Professor Felton, was the way that you curated so many inspiring examples from a range of disciplines, a range of different periods, theoretical examples, some great practical examples from the classroom, every one of which I am going to steal at some point over the next 5 years. You helped us to curate our own ideas and the exercises you led us through. And through your caring curation, what really became clear, I think, to all of us was that for you, teaching is really a shared journey of curiosity between the student and the teacher, where we not only share in curiosity, but we both share in the teaching and in the learning. So I love that you ended with that Dewey quote that says exactly that the teachers are doing as much learning and the students are doing as much teaching when we're getting it right. And for a good hour this morning, I had a vision of a world in which we're getting it right. So thank you very much for starting us off in a way that will help keep us curious and caring all day long. We would like to thank you with a small gift. I'll bet you're curious about what's in here. Please join me in thanking Professor Felton.